Welcome to the Mining and Metallurgical Society of America webinar series. MMSA is an association of mineral resource professionals whose members represent all facets of the mining and metallurgical interests, both domestic and internationally. If you are interested in becoming an MMSA member, please be sure to check out our website at mmsa.net for information on the application process. MMSA has always been a cohesive group of senior people from the mineral industry. The society is dedicated to increasing public awareness and understanding about mining and why mined minerals are essential to modern society and human well-being. The society concerns itself with fundamental principles and with problems facing the industry in areas such as legislation, economics and education, as well as environmental concerns, labor relations, and health and safety. Representatives of the society from time to time testify before legislative bodies and provide advice to federal agencies. I am Kristen Guerin-Davy, MMSA member and the social media and webinar director. I'll be introducing today's webinar. The title of today's webinar is A New Era of Competition in the Battery Supply Chain, Materials and Infrastructure Diplomacy as Weapons of War by Chris Berry, House Mountain Partners founder and president. Questions can be entered into the chat. The speaker will answer the questions after the presentation is completed. Please turn off your cameras unless you are asking a question. I'll hand it over to Curtis.
Thank you, Kristen, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Chris Berry is based in Washington, D.C., and he's been an independent analyst for the past 15 years with a focus on battery metal supply chains, including lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, copper, vanadium, and the rare earths. His work supports a roster of global clients, including investors, mining companies, oil and gas companies, and electric vehicle manufacturers across 6 continents. His advisory work has a specific focus on how battery metal supply chains are evolving to create opportunities and threats during the energy transition in the coming decades. Aside from the traditional supply, demand, and pricing analysis, his recent work has focused on battery recycling, alternative extraction technologies, and how battery metals will play an increasingly strategic role in geopolitical and supply chain alignment. Chris has visited and performed economic analysis of metals deposits on 6 continents and has been featured in multiple media outlets, including the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, NPR, the South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera, and CNN International. I'll hand it over to you now, Chris. We look forward to your address.
Thank you. And I think just Curtis, from listening to you, I feel like I need a shorter intro. So maybe when we do this next year, I'll cut it in half so we can cut right to the chase. Thank you very much, first of all, for the MMSA for inviting me back. I think we had a conversation about a year ago on a topic, and I really enjoyed it. And we had a great discussion going back and forth. And I hope, I'm able to provide some information and ideas today on a pretty complex topic that can bring about some more ideas and some more discussion as well over the next hour or so. And so before jumping in, just wanted to say thank you very much to Betty Gibbs and Kristen and Curtis, specifically for helping to put this together. And if there's anybody else out there that I haven't had the opportunity to interface with directly, thank you very much for the opportunity. And of course, if you're tuning in here, thank you very much for taking the time to again, hopefully discuss and debate some really interesting ideas. Again, I don't want to belabor who I am, but for those of you I haven't had the pleasure to meet, again, I've been involved in the critical metal space, the battery metal space for about the last 15 years. I am not a scientist. I am not a geologist or a hydrometallurgist, although I do find the mineralogical and metallurgical aspects of this whole discussion and debate absolutely fascinating. So I've really dedicated the last 15 years of my life to better understanding 2 parts of the supply chain, as Curtis had mentioned, the upstream portions. So if we are going to electrify the economy, where is all of the lithium, the raw materials, the cobalt going to come from? So traditional supply demand analysis, and also thinking hard about some of those downstream applications. How do we build recycling capacity here in the United States or in North America, or cathode capacity? So really working with a bunch of different types of players along the supply chain to better understand those details. And again, this is a slightly dated picture of me at 14,000 feet, about 4,000 meters in Argentina, smiling but gasping for breath. So anyways, if you get a chance to see any of these salars, it's well worth your time. Real briefly on the agenda, just want to take about the next maybe 25 minutes, okay, and share some ideas. And then that way we'll have plenty of opportunity for Q&A at the end. I'll start this presentation the same way I did last year for the MMSA. Just talk a little bit about where we've come and where we are today, where we are in the cycle. And, I think you'll probably take away, hopefully you'll take a lot of information away from this discussion. But I think one of the positive points is that, look, the good news is that we are at the bottom of the cycle, at least in my opinion, when you look at supply and demand dynamics for a lot of the battery metals and just sort of the state of play in the EV space. I think we're at the bottom or much closer to the bottom. And so the question is, when do we turn and what are the catalysts for that turn? And perhaps we can talk about that today. And then follow up a little bit on really this huge geopolitical challenge that I think not just the United States and China are facing, but we're facing globally. Talk a little bit about what President Trump is thinking or how he thinks, trying to get inside his head and better understand his view on what he would call energy dominance and what that means for all of us here in North America. The Chinese response, some potential outcomes, maybe how to interpret the back and forth here. And then, as I mentioned before, takeaways and Q&A. So, pretty straightforward. Okay, so I have used different iterations of this chart in past presentations. And so what you're looking at here is a price performance of 5 of the battery metals that I have covered for a long time: copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel, and graphite. And I apologize for some of the formatting. The white line is battery grade lithium carbonate. Okay, that is the price. And so you can see when for all of the focus, I guess, that all of the battery metals get, the star performer, maybe, the hero and the anti-hero is lithium in terms of booms and busts. You can see a slight blip there. The green line is nickel in early 2022. That really didn't have anything to do, though, with supply and demand and more issues with naked shorting of futures contracts by Chinese players. And so, it's been really challenging for a lot of the battery metals. And of course, if we zoom in here, you'd see even more volatility. And so that really is the name of the game. Price volatility. And so that leads to, in terms of framing out the discussion today, 3 of the major challenges. And again, there are more, but I think just in the interest of time and in terms of what is most important, there are 3 major challenges within North America in terms of building out a self-sufficient or a resilient battery supply chain. Number 1, as we just saw, was battery metals price volatility. I like to say that the volatility in price that we have seen, not just for lithium, but nickel and cobalt and so on and so forth, that's a feature of this industry, a feature of the energy transition, as opposed to a bug. In other words, what we have seen in the last 5 years, I would argue you're going to continue to see going forward until these metals, these markets for these metals, can get much larger and much more liquid. Okay, and so that's just going to take a while before that happens. So it's not going away anytime soon, which of course is challenging if you're looking at building a project here in North America, whether or not it's a mine or a refinery or a recycling facility, trying to get a handle on where pricing is going to be 5 years from now, given all the volatility that we've seen. It's just really, really challenging. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of the building has slowed somewhat in recent months. Second is capital. Not so much access to capital. Again, I work with a lot of investors of different shapes and sizes. It could be private equity, it could be hedge funds, it could be corporations. The good news with respect to North America is that we have the most liquid, deepest capital markets, availability of capital in the entire world. And so that's the good news. The challenge has always been not just the allocation of that capital, in other words, what does a company do once they get access to it, but the real challenge just in the last few years has been the cost of capital, and that is really manifested or viewed through inflation and the capital intensity of a lot of these metals and mining projects that we've seen here in North America. I can think of lithium projects that had full feasibility studies all tied up with a bow in, say, 2018, 2019 for, say, 30,000 tons of material per year, had a capex of, say, $700 million. Today, that same project same tonnage, same everything, is now over $1 billion in terms of capex. And so that, coupled with metals price volatility, presents a real challenge here, I think, as we try and build out the supply chains. And then finally, and thirdly, or I should say finally, pardon me, regulatory uncertainty, as you can see here. That is something that unfortunately is relatively new. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just set it out here on your book. Thank you.
Okay. David, I think you might want to jump on mute there if you wouldn't mind. So anyways, regulatory uncertainty, and we'll talk a lot about that here momentarily. Tariffs, export controls, rollback of subsidies. What does all of this mean for project economics as we try and build capacity, I should say, here in North America? If we take a look at, say, the last eight or 9 years here in the United States, and you sort of think about President Biden and his administration and his views on the energy future and what he was trying to build with respect to industry, green industry here in the United States, and you compare and contrast that with Trump, there are actually some similarities, despite the very stark differences. Okay, President Biden, through different pieces of legislation, I think probably most famously the Inflation Reduction Act, was focused mainly on public-private investments. So the idea of partnerships, whether or not it's Department of Energy loans or working together with large OEMs like General Motors to put capital into projects here in the United States to build out that green infrastructure. So it was really all about working with allies. President Trump, if the last sort of 6 weeks, the first portion of his presidency, or any indication, he is interested in going it alone. Allies be damned, for lack of a better phrase. And that has, I think, surprised a lot of people. I would say one difference where President Trump seems to be more focused that President Biden was not is on the upstream. So really addressing issues of security of supply of the raw materials, because it is those raw materials, again, the lithium, the cobalt, the graphite, the antimony, that are the building blocks of all of this green technology that we're talking about. And so those are some of the main differences. And again, we can go on and on, back and forth. One of the main similarities that I think surprised a lot of people, especially in the Biden administration, is both administrations' views on tariffs. Those of you who remember the first Trump administration, he, again, I think, even as he does now, likes to think of tariffs as this, sledgehammer that he can wield, and it's kind of a one-way deal. It's good for America and it's bad for everybody else. He was actually, I think, has been quoted as saying the word tariff is the most beautiful word in the English dictionary, although I know a lot of people that would disagree with that. That said, his views on tariffs and even President Biden's views on tariffs are somewhat similar. I think when President Biden was elected and was inaugurated into office, a lot of folks thought that the tariffs that that came into force under the first Trump administration, they'd be rescinded or dialed down. The opposite happened. They were actually ramped up, although they were more targeted and strategic as opposed to across the board. So some similarities and some differences for sure. And so, if we focus for a second here on Trump, I mean, again, I'm just trying to elaborate on some of the specifics here, but we've all heard the rhetoric around Canada, Greenland, Ukraine with security for resources types of deals. And this is, again, Trump being, I think, very confrontational and inflammatory and transactional. Some of his rhetoric is, I think, legitimate, and some of it arguably is not. I've got, Panama in here, a picture of Panama as well. That's not so much about resources as it is about control of strategic infrastructure. So I'm not here to tell you that Canada will be the 51st state or Greenland will become a part of the US. I'm certainly not here to predict that by any stretch of the imagination, but there will be some sort of a reckoning between the United States and these countries, and it will hinge on access to infrastructure, access to waterways, and of course, access to resources. And it just remains to be seen what those deals look like going forward. And again, just to keep on the Trump theme here momentarily, again, his views overall on energy and energy dominance are quite different from those of President Biden. the day that President Trump was inaugurated, January 20th, 2025. I think he signed something between close to 80 executive orders, one of which was focused on energy. Okay. And look, I mean, these are lengthy documents. We don't necessarily want to go through all of them, but he had talked a lot about energy dominance and emergency declarations. Again, trying to parse the rhetoric from the reality. There were some very interesting, I think, and pertinent things that were entered, that were, I guess, rolled out, if you will, in these executive orders, one of which is a full-scale review of permitting for natural resource development here in the United States. And so that is welcome. That was talked a lot about during the Biden administration, but it didn't really seem like we got very far. There was a lot of interagency meeting and things like that, but nothing really happened. And so hopefully during the Trump administration, we can get somewhere with permitting reform, because that will help really grease the skids here. And secondly, again, that executive order that was released on January 20th, I just sort of cut and paste what I view as the most important paragraph of the entire document. And it's basically President Trump, it's his administration saying, look, it is now the policy of the United States to basically become a leading producer of metals and also a processor of non-fuel minerals or metals. And so again, it's not enough, in my view, at least, just to have access to the resources or access to the mines. And this is one of the areas that Chinese interests actually really do dominate the global metal supply. It's not so much in the mining of the material, it's in the processing and the refining of the material. Lithium is a great example. About 60+% of all of the lithium that's mined ends up in China to be processed into battery grade material. And so, again, the idea of focusing on developing resources domestically, developing processing capacity domestically to reduce that influence of groups like China and Russia, countries like China and Russia, is a welcome sign. And so, as we talk about, I think, the balance of power and what the legislative landscape is going to look like here in Washington, D.C., again, there are a lot of balls in the air to try to understand this. And I would say, I was talking before this webinar started, I think, with Betty, and basically said, look, last year when I would speak with clients, the number one question was, what happens if Trump wins? What happens to all of this Biden era legislation? And of course, it's not really a binary outcome if Trump wins, but you have a different balance of power in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. The potential for changes to the Inflation Reduction Act could be significant, or they could be pretty low. And of course, one of the big surprises, I think, from the election last month, or last year, I should say, was not only did Trump win, but the Republicans won the House and the Senate. And so the takeaway there, the good news, if you're concerned about the Inflation Reduction Act being wiped away or something like that with a stroke of a pen, it's important to remember that the IRA is a law, and the only way it could be wiped out or rescinded would be through an act of Congress. So Trump couldn't just with the stroke of a pen, get rid of it. He could kind of cut away at the edges on some of the subsidies, and we'll talk about who the winners and losers are in those different scenarios. So you are likely to see some changes to the Inflation Reduction Act going forward, but they would be, I think, more cosmetic than anything else. And the reason is because so much of the IRA money that has been awarded, whether or not it's in the form of loans or grants, has gone into Republican-leaning districts, okay? What you can see on this screen on the left-hand side is a letter last month, actually last year, pardon me, August of 2024. It was co-authored or co-written by, I think, 16 or 17 different Republican members of the House of Representatives. And basically what it says is, listen, we all hate the IRA, but, let's not take a sledgehammer to this thing. They wrote the letter to Speaker Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House. Rather than taking a sledgehammer and crushing this piece of legislation, let's look at it more sort of with a scalpel or kind of dissect it. And again, the reason for that is because, as you see on the right-hand side of the screen, Republican-leaning district or Republican-represented districts are hosts to 200 projects worth about $107 billion of investment with, close to 80,000 jobs created. And that's just getting started. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's unlikely that you're going to see a whole full-scale wipeout of the Inflation Reduction Act. It is simply too beneficial to red states and red districts. In terms of the winners, it is very early days in terms of building a new supply chain or a battery supply chain here in the United States. Portions of the Inflation Reduction Act are enormously beneficial to foreign direct investment in particular. The main winners thus far, as you can see here, are Asian battery manufacturers, companies like LG Energy Solution or Panasonic or Samsung, who have set up very large plants here in the United States to produce battery materials and battery modules. And so one of the most lucrative portions of the Inflation Reduction Act or subsections is a subsection called 45X, named 45X. And what it basically says is that if you invest the capital here in the United States, you're a battery manufacturer, you invest the capital, if you produce modules, lithium-ion battery modules here in the United States, you can receive a $45 per kilowatt hour tax credit. And that is enormously beneficial to the point you can see I've got some dialog boxes here listing out some of the numbers. This information is slightly dated, but it hasn't changed. 215 billion won in IRA credits, 87 billion yen in IRA credits. Just to do some quick math, 87 billion yen at current exchange rates is about $500 million. And so this one plant in the United States that Panasonic is producing batteries from has generated $500 million, or about 19% of their 2024 net profits. So enormously lucrative for large companies to come and produce battery materials here in the United States. You are likely to see some of the other subsidies, though, either get cut or get drawn back. One of the most famous ones or well-known ones is Section 30D, and that provides a $7,500 tax credit for consumers who purchase electric vehicles that adhere to a whole host of different standards. And so those ones are likely to go away, but I would argue that something so lucrative as 45X is going to stay, and that's very good from a manufacturing perspective. On the downside, again, it's been challenging for non-Asian players to build and ramp battery production or even EV production capacity here in the United States. A couple of years ago, General Motors had said they will be producing 1 million electric vehicles, producing and hopefully selling 1 million electric vehicles here in the United States by 2025. They are at a current production capacity of about 300,000. So, look, they're not even close. And that's just reality. I'm not taking a swipe at them or anything like that. I think what it proves is that it takes much longer and much more capital to build out these supply chains than initially thought. That's at least a big part of it. And of course, Ford cutting orders, as they're losing about $5 billion a quarter on their EV business. And then some of the smaller battery manufacturers, Core Power and Freyr, have closed up shop here in the United States. It's simply economics. It goes back to what I had mentioned beforehand. You have low battery metals prices, EV demand that is still growing, but not where I think we thought it would be, and higher costs. And that's really hurt these companies that can't really operate at scale right out of the bat. So, some good news and some bad news, but it is early days going forward. So, the Trump tariff strategy, and we'll focus a little bit now on what I think are the challenges of building a business and also trying to operate in this new tariff regime and what it means for everybody. So again, just in the last couple of months, I think one of the biggest surprises to everybody, certainly to myself, is that President Trump has decided that tariffs won't just be used against our adversaries. In other words, it's not just a U.S. versus China thing or U.S. versus Russia thing. He's an equal opportunity employer, I guess, when it comes to levying tariffs. And so the shock has been levying them on our allies like Canada and Mexico. And so, of course, November of 2024, President Trump announced his plans for 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. A few days later, threatens 100% tariff on those BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, who are thinking of diversifying away from the US dollar. A couple months later, the 25% tariffs go into effect on Mexico and Canada, with very quietly also 10% tariffs across the board levied on China. And then 48 hours later, this is sort of recent history, we probably all remember that, a 1 month pause on Mexico and Canadian tariffs, but the Chinese tariffs stayed in place. And so, I think, look, we could go on and on with this timeline. It's obviously going to get much longer over the next coming days and weeks and months and years. But the usage, the widespread usage of tariffs is something that the Trump administration is going to continue with. And so that's going to force all of countries, whether or not they're allies or adversaries, to react. And react, I think they probably will. In terms of the impact of tariffs, and this is, I think, where it gets a little bit controversial. There's a wealth of academic and I think real world data out there on the effect of tariffs. And in general, it is the consumer of the country that is levying the tariffs that ends up suffering. There's some great research out there published, I think last year, by Indiana University. A professor there demonstrated that a 10% tariff rate, along with retaliatory tariffs, so tit for tat, would lower US GDP over a given year by 1.1%. That may or may not seem like very much, but when you factor in the idea, the reality that US GDP is about $30 trillion, that's a $300 billion hit to growth here in the United States because of just a 10% tariff. And so, again, the Trump administration has thrown numbers out there, 10%, 25%. I think they even talked about 60% tariffs on China. A 60% tariff on China would certainly bring more money into the Treasury, the US government, but at the expense of the American consumer, up to roughly $2,500 per family over the course of a year in terms of increased costs. So there are a lot of different ways to play this. We can talk about targeted tariffs. I think that the problem with targeted tariffs is that they don't go unanswered. We've seen that in the graphite supply chain. So we have put a 25% tariff on graphite imports, and the Chinese have effectively decided to stop exporting graphite to us without much more scrutiny. And so that actually speaks to China's response to this whole, I think, question around how to position to the Trump economic policy. And so, the interesting thing about China's response hasn't been very flashy. It hasn't been very loud. Xi Jinping isn't out there on some social media sites talking about what he's planning on doing. What we have seen just in the last few weeks is export controls on an increasingly large number of critical metals and minerals, germanium and gallium. I think those export controls happened last year, if I'm not mistaken. But since then, we've seen antimony, bismuth, tungsten, indium. And when I say export controls, it doesn't mean that China is hoarding this material or keeping it on shore. It's just much more difficult to source it from China if you're importing it, say, into the United States or the European Union. Seen some other creative aspects like drone battery export bans, restriction of lithium extraction technology exports. That one is particularly interesting. There's a company called Sunresin that is based in China that is a world leader in lithium extraction, water purification technology. And so cutting access to that technology off of the rest of the world could potentially limit lithium supplies going forward, ex-China. Doubling down on resource deals, sort of a Belt and Road response that many of us are aware of. And then, of course, China has responded in kind to a certain degree with tariffs on energy, US-based energy, in particular, coal and LNG, as well as 10% on crude oil. So, China's, I would argue, being much more creative and targeted in terms of how they approach the response here as they continue to build out their own domestic infrastructure and try and decouple from the rest of the world and build out these supply chains. Just to end, or to getting towards the end here on a positive note, even in the last few years, there have been a number of successes domestically here in the United States. Number one, it doesn't really have anything to do with green infrastructure, but of course, I think it's important to remember that the United States is the largest producer and exporter of LNG, and I believe the largest oil producer in the world today, which is something that I think for a long time was not the case. And if we focus on, again, some of the partnerships and some of the developments that we've seen just in the last 4 years, I've got a few of them listed here. Lithium Americans and General Motors are building what could ultimately be, or I think is designed to be, one of the largest lithium mines in the world, certainly the largest lithium mine in North America, to build a domestic supply chain. MP Materials, operating the Mountain Pass mine in California, right on the Nevada border there. They are now mining and separating rare earths. The mining was something that always happened onshore. The separating of that material used to have to go to China. That's not the case anymore. And then they have a goal of actual automotive grade magnet production with General Motors in particular towards the end of this year. And then finally, just on the recycling side, I'm sort of cherry picking a couple of examples here. Redwood Materials, former Tesla players, generating around $200 million in revenue today, producing copper anode foil, and also building a cathode active material facility out there in Nevada as well. So, this is just kind of scratching the surface. We're just getting going, I think, on some of these successes. But, it's not all doom and gloom, even though it does seem like a little bit of an uphill battle, given some of the policy and regulatory changes that we're seeing. So, just to finish with a few takeaways, again, I would encourage everybody who, whether or not you have a vested interest in economic security or national security or green growth here in the United States, to take a giant deep breath. This energy transition is happening with or without the United States. I would argue that, again, when you factor in access to capital, access to IP, and a whole host of other factors, the United States, North America more broadly, is actually still very well positioned, despite some of the uncertainties that President Trump and his administration have introduced into the subsidy regimes. And so you are likely to see some of those subsidies, like I mentioned, 30D, will be revoked, and some of the grants from the Department of Energy could be delayed. Although I think that's kind of a foolish thing to do. Nevertheless, this is the path we're on. I think that, look, the Trump administration does have one thing correct, and it kind of mirrors what I see as the Chinese model, and it's control the resources and control the technology in that order. I think one of the limitations during the Biden administration, of the Inflation Reduction Act, was it was very focused on midstream and downstream. So the building and the incentivizing of building refineries or recycling facilities, not so much building mines. Okay. And that was obviously always going to be a huge issue. And it seems to me like Trump is obviously much more open to mining. And so hopefully that'll be a good thing for all of us. So just finishing up here, the effectiveness of tariffs. Again, if I haven't telegraphed my views, I think they're counterproductive, and the effectiveness under the best of circumstances is not clear, but they're here to stay. Okay, and so we all have to adjust accordingly. And so I think one of the challenges, though, is if you combine tariffs and the increased costs, the potential uplift in inflation that they would add, along with immigration reform in this country, another very sensitive issue, it could mean that inflation is sticky. In other words, it doesn't sort of fall to the level that we'd want it to. Interest rates stay higher for longer in the United States, and that again could impede project development as we move forward here. So I'm sort of I look at a lot of different things, but I think, again, we've sort of talked about it a lot over the last, 20, 25 minutes. I look very closely and think a lot about the fate of Biden era legislation, because that has really set the table for a lot of this green industrial growth and how the United States can possibly compete going forward. Tariffs, obviously, you have to keep an eye on. The value of the US dollar and interest rates in particular, I think, are real keys to figuring out how quickly and how effectively we can build capacity here in the United States relative to the rest of the world. So with that, I will pause. I'm happy to take any and all questions. Again, I just want to thank all the folks at the MMSA for the opportunity to chat today. And you can see, here's how you can contact me on X or LinkedIn or shoot me an email. But yeah, happy to take any and all questions. And again, thanks for all of your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. We do have two questions or comments so far in the comments, and anyone else, please feel free to type those in. From Betty, she just wanted to comment about tariffs that other countries put on their exports back to the U.S. and balance with what the U.S. may impose.
Yeah, I think it I'm trying. I mean, well, this is part of the problem because, when President Trump, just to use Canada as an example, when President Trump had talked about or threatened the 25% blanket tariffs on Canadian goods, imported goods, and then I think it was 10% on oil. I think it was Chrystia Freeland or somebody in the Trudeau administration has said that, listen, they are going to target specific industries and specific industries in red states like Kentucky bourbon, or putting tariffs on, of 100% on imports of Teslas, things like that. So, it's not tit for tat in the sense that, Trump is out there saying it's 25%, it's 10%. I think that we haven't seen anything specific from the European Union. Of course, they haven't had any tariffs levied on them yet, at least not additional. I think the prudent way to play this is really what the Chinese are doing. Again, they're looking at specific industries. They are looking at specific companies. One of the things I might have not mentioned from that previous slide is that, look, the Chinese are obviously very interested in Western technology and always have been, and sort of been the bedrock that they have used to build their own technology base. But they're talking about anti-monopoly investigations against companies like NVIDIA or Google. So, tariff wars, if you will, I think have multiple methods or multiple ways to be played. But the bottom line is it gets very messy very quickly, and it's ultimately the consumer, I think, that ultimately loses here.
Yeah, great point. Um, from Mark, we have, assuming that the implementation of tariffs is sustained, what is the lag time before we see or before we begin to see manufacturing and mineral processing returning to the US?
It's a great question. I would have to think that, first of all, traditionally tariff implementation takes months. And that is one of the unique things about, I think, the Trump administration or President Trump, not saying pro or con either way. He does not need congressional consent or approval to levy tariffs. He can basically say, this is what we're going to do. And normally in past administrations, a president would say something like, okay, the domestic aluminum industry is getting killed, and so we're going to levy tariffs on it. Or the solar panel industry is getting killed here in the United States, and so we are going to prevent Chinese interests from dumping panels here in the U.S. That announcement would then take a 90-day study for recommendations, right, to go back to the president to say this is what we think we should do based on excess capacity in the supply chain. But look, to answer your question specifically, it is sort of dependent on the industry. I don't think you would really know the true extent of the costs and the mitigation of the costs for probably another 6 months until after they were implemented. Because what's going to happen, I would argue now, is even now without a lot of the tariffs having been implemented, I can guarantee you that countries on both sides of the border, whether or not it's in Canada, the United States, or Mexico or China, they're in their war rooms. They're all trying to figure out, well, how do we mitigate 25% tariffs? In other words, do we source things from other countries? Of course, there is a cost and also a time associated with setting up those supply chains. So I wouldn't think you would really see the effect of tariffs in the economic data or in the ability of companies to react to it for 6 months probably.
I guess kind of to continue on that note, just a thought from myself. I mean, do you feel like even if we do see that impact of tariffs without any sort of legislative permitting change, is there, really something that, US miners can actually do to take advantage of this?
Yeah, you've got to have some sort of, I mean, look, what are we trying to do? Okay, here in the United States, if we're going to try to compete with China, it's never going to happen. Okay, we will never be able to compete with the scale and the low cost of production that the Chinese have sort of built up over the last 10, 15, 20 years. What we have to do is innovate. Um, in terms of, Kristen, to answer your question specifically, what can we do in general? I think that, look, saying government needs to be involved, that tends to turn a lot of people off, and we all want free markets and so on and so forth. But if we could build some sort of a stockpile for these raw materials, or if we could guarantee a floor purchase price for the lithiums or the cobalts of the world, that would go a long way in terms of incentivizing getting this capacity built. But again, it's challenging. I mean, there are offtake agreements that I have seen between mining companies and car companies that do have floor prices. In other words, the car company agrees to, they will pay within a certain band. Say I'll just make up a number between $12,000 and $20,000 per ton for lithium. So that does narrow it, and that gives certainty, right, to both the OEM and the lithium mining company in particular. But that doesn't really answer the question of, well, how do you get the mine built in the first place?
Yeah.
You've got to have much more certainty and a much more streamlined permitting process. And that's just something that, it's not specific to the United States. It's challenging in Canada, it's challenging in the EU. I'm actually much more optimistic about getting mining capacity built here in North America, in the United States, relative to almost anywhere else in the world. It really just becomes a cost issue. And that's why there is going to have to be, I talked earlier about public-private partnerships. There's going to have to be some sort of a situation where, the government is involved in sort of a guaranteed pricing scheme or something like that.
All right. Yeah, those are some really good points. From Curtis here, have you heard how close district lithium extraction might be to commercialization and disrupting the solar lithium business?
Yeah, I think it's a long ways away. Direct lithium extraction, for those of you on the call who aren't aware, direct lithium extraction, and I apologize for my dog in the background, is I think the UPS man might be at the door. So sorry for the barking. Yeah, direct lithium extraction is, I think, years away, 5 years away from widespread commercial production. That said, it is commercialized. So there's a company called Arcadium Lithium. They have commercialized direct lithium extraction down in Argentina. I mentioned earlier Sun Resin over in China. They are using direct lithium extraction to exploit high cost, low quality brines in Western China. Direct lithium extraction is actually a combination of several different technologies. It could be solvent extraction, ion exchange, or absorption. And the challenge with direct lithium extraction is that the technology that you use and the combination of those technologies is highly dependent on the complexity of the brine. Okay, so the way that I would try and extract lithium from, say, old oil fields in Alberta versus, high cost brines in Western China, it's going to be different. It's going to be very different. And unfortunately, I think also one of the reasons why we haven't seen DLE make more of an impact is partially because of the low lithium price has really hurt these economics. But again, because of inflation throughout the supply chain, the whole idea behind direct lithium extraction was, okay, well, it's going to be CapEx advantageous, if that makes any sense, simply because you don't have to use evaporation ponds with direct lithium extraction. So you should save upwards of 30% on your CapEx, but just because of general inflation and technical challenges in terms of leveraging up and scaling up DLE projects, you've seen CapEx for a lot of DLE projects here in the Western world that are about the same for traditional brine projects. So there's really not a cost savings either on the CapEx or the OpEx side, despite the fact that you may have higher yields with DLE relative to traditional brines. So I'm hopeful. I mean, there is a role for DLE going forward, especially with as fast as the lithium market is growing. But thus far, it has not lived up to the hype.
Okay. Another question here. What future of LIB recycling industry in the US do you envision amid this tariff war and overall Trump policies?
Yeah, I would say in the following decades, so let's say the early 2030s onward, I am enormously bullish on lithium ion battery recycling. The challenge now is that, again, you have all of those challenges that I mentioned beforehand. You have high interest rates, meaning the cost of capital is quite high to build projects. You have low metals prices, and you just have a lack of scale, right, and a lack of sort of expertise here in North America. You don't have the full supply chain like you do in China. If you look at China today, I would argue that the battery recyclers in China are probably 10 years ahead of where we are here in North America, and it's because they were building out that capacity 10 years ago, and they do have basic advantages with respect to access to feedstock and costs. But nevertheless, I could see a situation where towards the end of the next decade, so say from 2035 onwards, you say you get we will get a recovery in metals prices. They're going to fluctuate, but you have higher metals prices, maybe inflation moderates. I could see a situation where towards the end of the next decade, battery recycling serves as a majority of the feedstock for battery production relative to virgin mined material. And again, that's kind of I'm sort of sticking my neck out there by saying that, and a lot of the mining companies don't believe that or don't want to hear it. But I do think that if we could get the capacity built here in the United States, or even in North America for that matter, recycling makes a tremendous amount of sense. It's just the economics that are hurting it right now. So very bullish, but not for a number of years.
Great. That should be interesting to see how that one plays out.
Yeah, I hope I'm right.
From Lewis, how do we see environmental objections thwarting forward movement in the development as it has in the past?
Yeah, I don't see that changing, I think, is my default take. When you look at some of the recent environmental challenges that domestic lithium projects have faced, whether or not it's Rhyolite Ridge run by Ioneer out in Nevada, or Lithium Americas, the Thacker Pass project, those projects have been delayed. The delays to those projects because of environmental lawsuits, they've been measured in years. And I'm not sure if it was necessarily the environmentalists' intent to kill the project or just sort of delay it, but they have been delayed. And so without some sort of permitting reform, as I mentioned beforehand, and again, what would that look like? I mean, you would probably have a lot of cross-departmental collaboration to try to streamline things, and maybe a statute of limitation on lawsuits, things like that. That would certainly help. But as we sit here today, the lawsuit seems to be the most potent kind of weapon if you're an environmentalist to really, slow down the development of a lot of these projects. And so, yeah, it's a real challenge without, I think, the politicians stepping in and doing something.
Here's another one from Mark. Several mines had their permits pulled by the Biden administration, resolution in Arizona, Twin Mills in Minnesota, federal coal leases, moratorium in the Powder River Basin, etc. Would you care to make some predictions on what's going to happen with this sort of thing under Trump?
Well, I'm not. I'm a little hesitant to make a prediction. I'm familiar with resolution, and I think the bias would be to have those projects permits reinstated. I mean, I guess that would be my prediction or my view, simply because, again, I think that President Trump has made it very clear that he is focused on the upstream development. Again, I don't think that necessarily means that, another lawsuit couldn't pop up to slow things down, but I would argue that, the bias is for project approval as opposed to project delay. And I apologize, I'm not quite as familiar with some of the projects that you had mentioned, but I think just in general, I would be much more optimistic over the next 4 years about permits getting put through. I mean, as a reminder, I talked a couple of times over the course of this presentation about Thacker Pass in out in Nevada. That was actually approved by the Trump administration the first time. It happened right at the end of his administration. And of course, as I mentioned before, it had to go through some lawsuits during the Biden administration from some local tribes, I believe. But nevertheless, the Biden administration did not get in the way of that one. So, yeah, I'd be cautiously optimistic about some of these larger critical metals projects getting reinstated.
Great. From Ressa, we have, you said you expected the Inflation Reduction Act spending to go forward, but what about the impoundments the Trump administration is trying to use?
It's a great question. And when I was putting this presentation together, I referenced the impoundments and the Impoundment Act, and I just took it out because of spacing issues. So for those of you on the call who aren't familiar with what we're referring to, in 1974, President Nixon was behaving, I guess, in much the same way President Trump is today, in terms of trying to dictate when and how congressionally approved spending is pushed out the door and is spent. And the way that things are supposed to work, right, is that the United States Congress has what's called the power of the purse. That is an actual phrase in the Constitution. And the executive branch does not. And so, in order to prevent the president in 1974 from basically slowing down congressionally approved funds going out the door, Congress passed what is called the Impoundment Act, which effectively reiterates what is in the Constitution, which says that the president cannot. It's basically illegal for the president to slow down or halt congressionally approved funding. And so, what do I think ultimately will happen here in terms of predictions? I think President Trump will continue to either slow down congressionally approved funding or just try and halt it altogether, which will end up in a giant lawsuit, which will probably end up in front of the Supreme Court. Given the Republican majority in the Supreme Court, 6-3, it's hard to say. I think if you read the law as it's written, it's hard to see how the president can impound congressionally approved funds. But again, with some of the bias potentially on the Supreme Court, or maybe the political leaning on the Supreme Court, perhaps Trump might get his way. And if he does, then that would seriously impede any and all IRA disbursements, in particular from the Department of Energy. Some of the loans and grants could be frozen or perhaps clawed back and reallocated. So that's why a lot of the Department of Energy money, taxpayer funds that were dispersed in the form of loans or grants were first done conditionally. And it's pretty difficult for some of these companies to get access to that capital, right? They have to have reserve accounts that they have to go out into the public markets and raise that capital. So I understand, everyone's trying to avoid another sort of green blow up or anything like that. But coming back to your question, I think ultimately it will be the Supreme Court that decides whether or not President Trump can impound these funds. And so when will that happen? Does that happen in 2025? It remains to be seen.
Great. That was a really good answer for that. Well, with that, many thanks to Chris Berry for his excellent presentation. Thank you so much for attending the webinar as well. Our March webinar is confirmed for March 28th, 2025 on SK 1300. You will get a notice of our upcoming webinars as details are finalized. The webinars are generally scheduled for the third Friday of each month. All of our webinars are uploaded to YouTube and can be accessed through the mmsa.net website. The video of this webinar will be up on the website within 10 days, a little delayed due to the SME conference. The MMSA webinars are supported by the MMSA Jacqueline Foundation. We will send you a notice when the video and slides are posted on the website. If you are interested in becoming an MMSA member, please be sure to check our website at mmsa.net for information on the application process. The webinar is now ended. Thank you so much.